Michael Eric Dyson, Finding the Funk, Take 1.
How you doing, sir?
How you doing, my man?
So, what to you, if someone asked you what funk music was, what would you say?
Wow. Well, you start with the term itself. We know it comes from the Congo, lafuki, which means bad body odor. So what I love about some of these black musical terms like jazz, there are all these curse words or these obscenities that are derived from other languages applied to black culture. And what we do, is, funk is like sonic chitlins. We work out all the nastiness and the grease, and we take it and process it and make something out of it, something bad body odor into something beautiful. Early jazz musicians were talking about funk in terms of mellow music. They were talking about a process of working out the energy of their creativity, and the funk was what it gave birth to. But then later on, of course, it became much more frenetic, much more turbulent. Those frenetic bass lines, those turbulent drum beats. And it became a way of rebelling against a narrow conception of black music, especially in the more refined R&B scene. So just like bebop was to swing, where it's an aesthetic rebellion, musically in terms of how it sounds, but also an intellectual one because they wanted to deliberately impose black themes on their art. I think funk music was a beautiful way of grasping hold of the street element of black music and the kind of urban realism that was afoot then, talking about riots, talking about culture, talking about poverty, talking about racism and the like. And so funk music for me is that kind of, instead of R&B's chord progressions, those vamping on a single chord, taking it the genius of repetition, which is what African culture has been about. So you saw Africa writ large in funk music as a sound collage of the best of black identity.
What artists to you represent funk? If you say, who's funk to you?
Well, immediately James Brown comes to mind. I mean, because what James Brown did, when you think about it, 64, 65, when his music noticeably shifts and you begin to hear his voice become a percussive element. The voice itself becomes, in a beautiful rhythmic way, open to multiple and polyrhythms. So you hear that shift. James Brown fathers funk, arguably Sly Stone raises it. So James Brown gave birth to this sound through experimentation, through improvisation, through road work. I think that's another thing we have to accentuate, is that these funk musicians are musicians playing in live environments where their musical aesthetic derives from their interaction with the group. So when you talk about contrapuntal stuff and you talk about antiphony and you talk about playing off of stuff and call and response, that's what's integrated into their music. And James Brown's live shows, I think, gave rise to that. Now he credits, I think, Little Richard, and his band for exactly the Upsetters in a very serious way and many of whom then came to work for James Brown for actually creating that sound. But James Brown, I think, facilitated the birth of funk in America, and his voice became an extension of the instrumentality, the rhythm, the syncopation, and what the bass later did with it. So when I think about funk, I also think about Sly Stone. Well, Sly Stone and Norman Whitfield, to me, the wah-wah paddle distorting the guitar sound, those frenetic bass lines, those turbulent drum beats that gave birth to funk modernism. And funk modernism to me is not simply an appreciation for how the music had to be ramped up and had to be so multiple, so polyrhythmic and syncopated, but it was also about the themes, talking about urban existence, talking about stuff that polite R&B music would never touch, with the exception maybe of Marvin Gaye early on. So I think in that sense, when I think about funk, I think about James Brown, I think about Sly Stone, and then in the next generation, I think about the great Prince.
So, one of the things interesting about funk as a movement was, to me, that it was, I call it Afrofuturist music.
Yeah.
Tell me what you thought the elements of the future were. I mean, remember, funk comes out of the era of Star Wars.
Right,
E.T.
exactly. Right.
Hollywood is dealing with sci-fi, but they're not dealing with black people in the future.
Well, exactly. I mean, in one sense, they're the acceptable Sam Delaney's of the musical front, right? So the Afrofuturism is about cosmic spirituality. It's about the oneness of all humanity.